Right? Thanking God the Father, the Son, and the Spirit for the way that they can simplify seemingly complicated things. Let's call this chapter, the last chapter of the book of Galatians, Galatians 6, complicated because it's actually not all that complicated. At least the things that God is asking us to do, they are really not all that complicated, as Paul is going to seem to indicate in a very famous passage toward the middle of this chapter. But the thing that can make them feel complicated is all the drama and stress that can go along with the simple things that he has called us to do. In this chapter, that seems to begin picking up the baton from chapter 5, as it talked about two paths leading to two different, as we mentioned, aharits, ends or destinations. One, indulging the flesh, which the Common English Bible, at least in Romans 8, is often going to literally translate as self-interest. And the other path, being guided by the Spirit, even if we don't always have a clear idea of what we're doing or where we're going. He is saying there are some red flags for times in which you and the things that you want are enslaved to self-interest or the flesh, and times when you have resisted the temptation to allow your desires to pretty much just give in. As we said, using that illustration of Christianity is, as an older, wiser preacher once said, a constant course correcting procedure, where if you look at it as driving a windy road before the days of self-driving cars, you would not expect to be able to survive that road without keeping your hand engaged in steering according to the turns on that road. Likewise, as he ends up chapter 5 saying that you need to keep in step with the Spirit, you have to constantly steer your wants into the things that God is telling you are red flags for a healthy relationship with him, or actually he said blue or green flags for a healthy relationship with him, as opposed to the red flags for self-indulgence. All that aside, though, he is going to start out by seeming to talk about the reality in a body of believers. There are going to be some who are possibly more spiritual than others. You do not cast away those who do not seem like they are 10 toes down in being spiritual or steering into the signs of having a healthy relationship with God. And so he is going to start out by saying, if anyone is caught in any transgression, quite possibly living in some form of servitude to that list of red flags or symptoms that he said for self-interest, he said, help them out. But he's not talking to everybody. He says those who are spiritual, those who are 10 toes down in those symptoms or signs, that you're not just glowing spiritually like Moses might have done when he came down off of the mountain with God for 40 days and 40 nights. No, it's not some spiritual glow. It's basically, as we said, the Hebrew writer will say, you are in the habit of steering away from self-interest and into those signs of spiritual fruit that he talked about in chapter 5. And so if you are actually in the habit of steering out of your own self-interest and into things that God has told you are basically higher values, then you can help people who are not necessarily as progressed or accomplished along that road. Reminds me of the illustration we have in, as I say from time to time, AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, or maybe Narcotics Anonymous, or maybe OAE, the OEA, Overeaters Anonymous, where it's basically modeled on the principle, even if you don't agree with the tenets, that those who are more accomplished in sobriety are helping those who are less accomplished. And that reminds me of what Paul is saying here. Spirituality is not having this glow or outward radiance that can be projected, even if the inside isn't really healthy. He literally told the Corinthians, I think it was 1 Corinthians 15, that even the enemy projects himself as an angel of light. So that's not what spirituality looks like. It looks like someone who is in the habit of sacrificing self-interest to produce the fruits of the Spirit that he mentioned in the last chapter. And so those who are spiritual are to restore those who are struggling. But of those signs of spiritual health or growth, he's going to say, emphasize that spirit of gentleness. And it's not enough to simply be able to help people. The how we go about it is really important. And so one of the fruits of the Spirit is gentleness. He's going to say, do that or help others in a spirit of gentleness. But just because we might be in a spiritually strong place, confident to help others, he's going to say that isn't enough, because in helping others, it's like the old lifeguard example. You got to be careful of the folks you're trying to help, because you can be dragged down too. And so he's going to go on to say, keep watch for yourself. So he's going to go on and talk about, I'm going to emphasize the action word, the verbs, bear one another's burdens. And so he is calling those who are doing relatively well to realize that you have a responsibility beyond yourself. And the cool thing about the letter to the Galatians is he doesn't have to write to the Galatians as much as he had to write to the Corinthians about you really need to care about one another. So this seems to be one area in which the Galatians may not be struggling. He's simply helping them realize or remember that it's part of their responsibility in bearing their own load, as he's going to talk about toward the end of that first section. It also includes bearing one another's burdens. And so he's going to say that is the way that you will then fulfill the law of Christ. Going beyond knowing we need to, as we said in the last chapter, put to death the self-interest or the flesh. You show it by helping others on their journey or efforts to do that as well. And one of the ways that it's important, or one of the reasons why it's important to do that, is because it helps you have a sober judgment or sober estimation of where you are actually walking in your relationship with God, as he's going to say. Verse 3, for if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself, but let each one test his own work to see if you're doing all of these very simple things. Look out for one another. Get too, far afield, but look out for one another. And also look out for the things of God before even your own self-interest. And those are the basics that'll get you to where you need to go. And how do you know it's not all that complicated? Well, I'm stammering, but in verses 6 through 10, he's going to say, make the very famous statement that it's not all that complicated. Verse 7, do not be deceived. God is not mocked. Whatever you sow, you will reap, whether good or bad. And that's the famous statement that just about everybody can relate to and understand, because whether you picked up a Bible or not, you've probably heard you reap what you sow. And it is actually biblical, and it actually comes from this passage, as he is going to use that as a principle to say that even though the things that God is asking us to do in denying ourselves and accepting his counsel as how we can get in the habit of being people who are more intuitively just, like we said, the kind of people he wants to be around forever, the thing that complicates it is life stress. And so he is going to say, do not grow weary, verse 9, as we are doing these things that he has called us to do, because in due season we will reap if we do not give into the temptation, my ad lib, to give up. But another thing we can be tempted to do is, short of giving up, scaling back or closing off our hearts in ways that also displease God. And so he's going to say additionally in verse 10, so then as we have opportunity, let us do good to our buddies? No, to everyone, and especially those who are, especially to those who are of the household of faith. And so another temptation can be, as Jesus prophesied toward the end times, because lawlessness would increase, the love of many would grow cold. And it seems like Paul is writing to encourage us to make sure that we do not fall into the temptation to realize, once again, that the things that God is calling us to do are not always all that complicated, but the penalty, sometimes the fact that you can be punished for doing kind things, can make it feel complicated to keep trying to show kindness. And so he is helping us to understand the two obstacles that seem to complicate it are basically life. The things that life can do to us to make us want to give up, and beyond simply flat out giving up, the things that life can do to us to make us want to withhold affection or kindness that we otherwise should still be giving as far as God is concerned. But he is then going to go on and move toward an end to the letter to the Galatians in verses 11 through 16 by additionally saying, another thing that can complicate the simplicity of what God is calling us to do is the desire to just be free of drama. And Paul is stating that to the Galatians in the form of them wanting to be free of persecution, reminding us of what we talked about at the very beginning when he said it's not only the Galatians that felt the pressure, but the apostles themselves felt the pressure that even if they weren't tempted to alter the truth of what God was telling them to do, they were tempted to alter their behavior in ways that might have been just as unhealthy. Understanding that, Paul mentioned rebuking Peter directly because he was leading others who had devoted their lives to the word astray. And so likewise, he is, like we said, sometimes bookending the point, beginning with helping them understand that they can't avoid persecution by watering down the truth of what God has given them to say and to be. Likewise, he is saying once again here, the motive for doing that is flat out to avoid persecution. And as we said, there are two ways to go about doing it. It can be by trying to blend the truth of what it really means to be a follower or disciple of Christ with something else that helps us be a better fit with sometimes it's not just something that can help us avoid persecution. It can be a better fit with something we have an ambition to do. Understanding what he talked about in the last chapter, one of the struggles we have is to overcome the desire to put what we want ahead of the truth of what God is telling us. And likewise, it reminded me of the problem that Ananias and Sapphira had back in the book of Acts when, in the enthusiasm of the first church, they started selling their stuff and giving it all away. Basically having a lot of things, if not, it says, I think, really all things in common. But Ananias and Sapphira wanting to get the praise of giving at the level everybody else was giving, but not wanting to make the sacrifice, they sold some property, but they withheld a portion of it for themselves, taking credit for doing what everybody else was doing, and that was giving everything. And they had to pay a heavy price for the deception of acting like they were fully serving God when they were withholding a piece for something that they quite possibly had another ambition for, or they had another place they wanted that money to go. And so likewise, beyond the money, we can do that same thing with ourselves if we are not careful. So if we are not careful and we ignore the warning that Paul gave back in chapter 5. The flesh wars against the spirit so that we do not get to do the things that we want to do. Our desires are simply an illusion that can keep us from facing the reality that we are caught in the middle of two powers that are stronger than we are, and we are going to have to pick which one we are going to serve. Bob Dylan, once again, it might be the devil or it might be the Lord, but you're going to have to serve somebody. So likewise, when Paul is saying here that one of those dangers or things that can complicate the simplicity of what God is asking us to do is wanting to be free from persecution, he's also going to seem to suggest earlier in verse 12 that pretense is one of those things that can also complicate the simplicity of what God is calling us to do, wanting to appear like we are more fully Christian than we actually are. And with that, he is going to close out the book or his letter to the Galatians by basically summing up what we're supposed to be in verse 15 by saying we're supposed to be a new creation, which isn't all that different from what he wrote to the church at Rome or the believers in Rome in chapter 12 when he talked about agree that we need to be a living sacrifice, transformed by the renewing of our minds. Once again, into something that God would want to be around forever. Which is why we often say, God's best to you as you go forward with him. Likewise, as we often say, my prayer for you is my prayer for me. God, help us to overcome the belief that we are free agents as opposed to those who are going to have to pick who we're going to serve. It might be the devil or it might be the Lord, but we're going to have to serve somebody. God's best to you as you go forward with him.